good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to actually all the panelists and all the participants actually joining us from all over the world from different time zones. Thank you very much for being with us. And Mark, of course, actually you set the stage very correctly, actually, for this session today, which is a very important topic for the globe, for the world, and as well as for the Pacific. I think today we discussing about the climate change impact on the Pacific ports, very specifically to the Pacific region. And so before we move on to the presentation, I would like to give a brief introduction about the Solomon Ports and where we are, what we are doing, and our setup here. So Solomon Ports is in a part of the Pacific region of sharing the common waters with our big brothers like Australia and New Zealand, and with many other smaller ports and smaller regions like from Fiji, Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga, New Cap, even Papua New Guinea, and many other Pacific island nations. So we are a bit isolated from different parts of the world, but of course actually we are a very dynamic a region, and setting actually certain goals actually for our sustainability. But the impact of climate change has been very challenging for us in the last decades, especially in terms of our sustainability, and also maintaining our economy and also our livelihoods as well. So the main topic of today, we want to discuss about the impact of the climate change to the Pacific ports, and what we have been experiencing so far, what are the challenges, and what affects our sustainability, but what in the meantime, what we can do with, how we can make ourselves more resilient to climate change and its impacts. So as we all know, climate change is nothing new. This is actually an accumulative effect or damage which we have done to our world for the last couple of decades, and now actually we are experiencing some of the negative impacts, and it's largely result in challenging times actually for small island nations and small island ports. So primarily that's what we really wanted to talk about this topic, and then the main intention for Solomon Ports to host this event, and with a profound panelist and from diverse and very important organizations. And so today actually I would like to share a brief presentation of the impact of climate change to Pacific ports and its sustainability. But I'm going to talk about actually very briefly on a very certain area, because actually the rest of the panelists are going to talk about some important areas of infrastructure and the impacts, and of course from different other global initiatives to mitigate some of the challenges, and as well as even to reduce the carbon emissions. So let me share my presentation with you first. So briefly on the topic of climate change and impact on Pacific ports and future sustainability. So I would like to just run through a couple of screenshots, and my presentation is very brief. I want to first discuss about some of the impacts of climate change to our region, specifically like for Solomon Islands. I think I have just a few images, but this is actually not the exhaustive list, but many more evidence actually we can prove how climate change has impacted us in the Pacific region and the Pacific ports. This is actually some of the recent ones. Again, I think they are just described the A, B, C, especially the three majors. And if you look at the first one, it's A. Of course, we have also actually experienced climate change in a very bad way in the recent past, and which has resulted in the disappearance of several islands in Solomons. And the reason that is the cyclone Pam battered Vanuatu and causing $1 billion in damage to the communities, infrastructure, and many more. And the image C actually talks about that is about the rising sea levels in Samoa. So these are some, these are the impacts, the effects of climate change to our communities in general. But there are many more examples, many more evidence. I'm pretty sure, because this is evident to actually most of the the participants and anybody who is actually browsing and trying to understand actually how it impacts the Pacific island nations. So briefly, I would like to talk about how this impacts on ports, especially on the Pacific ports. The recent the cyclone, and of course, recent is like in 2015, the cyclone Pan caused severe damage to Port Vila, FRT in Vanuatu. And again, in 2011, floods inland local coal mines in Queensland, in Australia, reduced the throughput of Port of Gladstone by around 40 million tons. So that's a huge impact in Port of Gladstone as a result of the inland flooding. The heat wave in Australia, in 2019, closed the Melbourne ports actually for almost 3 days, and 2019 Cyclone Harold caused nearly $500,000 US dollars damage to Solomon ports, destructing many of the terminal lighting poles into the seawall, and also causing damage to the containers and other infrastructure as well. So this is just some of the incidents of how it has been affecting us, and this is just a small sample of incidents to ports, but it's more widespread and more destructive than what we think. So we can understand when how the climate change not only actually affects us actually in terms of our economy and the livelihood, especially in our infrastructure, the ports. Sometimes the ports has to be closed, and it causes widespread destruction. And in terms of infrastructure, and as small island nations and small island ports, our economies are dependent on the ports, and it's quite difficult for us to close a port and again spend so much of money on repairs. And so this is a very important topic for us, and to draw some attention of the global leaders and some of the countries, and for us to again, how we can help the Pacific, what are the resilience strategies, how we can make ourselves sustainable, and also within the Pacific region, for us to understand how we can actually mitigate these circumstances to a great extent, and we make ourselves more resilient going forward. So while actually we talk about this, I want to draw your attention, what challenges us most in Pacific. Now, these are some of the challenges that we have been facing in the last couple of decades, especially the rising sea levels, and that's how it affects the ports. Storm surges, high swells. This also impacts our efficiency, and in some times of the year, especially in Solomon's concern, we have northeasterly winds affecting us for more than 9 months of the year, and this affects our efficiency in the ports, especially in different berths. Even though since we have multi-purpose berths, our operation is primarily based on the ship gear. So we don't have ship-to-shore cranes or even other cranes actually to run our operation. So when there's high winds, this affects our operation very bad. So we cannot achieve certain level of productivity. But it's a lot of other things. We're trying our level best to maintain certain productive levels. So we can see exactly like how this affects on the port side. And on top of that, the sea surface salinity leading to high rates of corrosion. And this affects our infrastructure, even the fenders, and even in time to time, actually, I think the maximum shelf, the shelf life of fender in our setup is not more than 3 years. So every 3 years, actually, we'll have to change some of the fenders, remove and refix some of the components of that. So it's been very, very challenging for us in terms of the corrosion is concerned. The sedimentation rates keeps, and also depending on the sea currents, and it's changing the patterns. So we have to sometimes bridge to make sure actually we have enough sufficient draft for vessels. So these are some of the challenges that we faced most with the impact of climate change. And this affects the ports, our economies, and as well as our livelihood, and then in a different way and it's kind of a vicious cycle that it is not only the ports actually directly, but it has overarching impacts on our economies, because we are primarily, in the Pacific, we are primarily dependent on seaborne transport for the development and growth of our small economies. So it affects our revenue, it affects our future viability. So these are areas that we would like to emphasize in how the challenges we face most, and our sustainability in future. So moving to the next slide, I would like to talk about, now I think we have a very profound set of panelists about talking about, different areas, but I would like to talk about, how we can be more resilient when it comes to ports, and in terms of, the resilience to, port resilience to climate risk and adaptation techniques. So what can make us more sustainable? So we know this is happening, and we need to find a way out, and how we can be sustainable. We understand actually, our constraints when it comes to investments, and our constraints like when it comes to resources, but we also actually call for the attention of some of our neighboring countries, and as well as some of the organizations, to look at Pacific in a different way, help the Pacific, to make us more sustainable. And also, we also have a duty of care for our own nations, and as well as the ports, and see what we can do to mitigate certain circumstances. So the one thing actually I would like to recommend is, it's as ports, entering into these and facing these challenges, it's very important for us to do some assessments and to understand, some of the risks that we face, and also to carry out some of the vulnerability assessments to understand what are these risks actually facing the ports, and how we can prioritize them, how we can action them based on actually the severity of the challenges we face. And construction of resilient infrastructure is one way, we can always be resilient and climate proofing, this infrastructure. But this is not easier than said, because the amount of actually the money that we are invest on infrastructure is huge. And if you look at the total volume in the Pacific, apart from our neighboring big brothers, that's Australia and New Zealand, if you look at the volume throughput in the Pacific, it's still less than 750,000 TUs. So it's not even actually 1 million of TUs. So with such a small volume, and which is distributed among all the ports, and the revenue that we earn, it is quite difficult for us to construct some of the infrastructure, and probably we'll have to look for certain climate financing, and then getting certain soft loans and so on and so forth. So these are some of the areas how we can adapt to some of the climate changes or the impacts of the climate change and the climate risk that we face as a region. Develop actually a certain guidelines, best practices, checklists, and method and tools to support the adaptation is very important for us to understand how actually we can implement them better, and then assess the risk portfolio and see what we can do to mitigate these circumstances. And even in terms of energy efficiency, we are looking at many avenues we can reduce our emissions to as much as possible, and also as a strategy to be more resilient and sustainable, to reduce the energy cost by using and investing on energy efficient machines and techniques in the seaports, and also the use of renewable energy as much as possible to lower the cost of operations, and also to be more sustainable in future. So these are some of the areas that actually I would like to propose, and that we would like to discuss further, how actually we can be, we know we cannot avoid climate change, and some of these impacts cannot be overturned actually within overnight. So the most important thing is for us to understand the vulnerability, the risk, and do some proper assessments, and understand how we can be more sustainable, and using different methodologies as well. And again, I think I discussed this very briefly about access to climate finance, and this is one way of the Pacific region, especially the Pacific ports, can tap into actually the resources to help us to rebuild resilient infrastructure, and even and invest on and different other methods, like especially energy efficient methods to reduce our cost of operation and also our emissions as well. And also the most importantly, they prioritize the adaptation options for better resilience. That's the most important thing that I would like to actually communicate through my presentation and the discussion, how we can be, it's because for us, this is something we cannot avoid. So we need, somehow we need to mitigate, but somehow we need to adapt some of the techniques to better face some of these challenges and make us sustainable going forward. So this is these are the few areas that I want to discuss and with my fellow panelists, and how we can make the Pacific ports more resilient and sustainable in future with the impacts of the current climate change. So this is very briefly that I want to discuss, and I'm really happy that I can represent the Pacific in this case, and let's make a voice for the Pacific ports. That's the message I want to convey today. Thank you very much.